She never imagined that saving her family's honor would chain her to the most dangerous man in the Arizona Territory, an Apache warrior whose silence concealed scars deeper than any bullet wound. But in the heart of the unforgiving desert, she would uncover the truth that transformed fear into something neither of them expected. Arizona Territory, 1881. The dust never truly settled in Copper Ridge. It simply hung in the air like a veil between the living and the dying. Vivian Marshall stood at the window of the town's only courthouse, her gloved hands gripping the wooden sill so tightly her knuckles had gone white beneath the fabric. At 23 years old, with chestnut hair pinned severely back and eyes the color of honey in sunlight, she had never imagined her life would come to this moment. This impossible choice that felt more like a noose tightening around her throat than a decision. Agisek. The Arizona sun beat mercilessly through the wavering glass, casting harsh shadows across the cramped room where her fate was being decided by men in dusty suits who saw her as nothing more than a bargaining chip. A means to an end in a conflict that had already claimed too many lives. Miss Marshall, Judge Cornelius Watts said, his voice carrying the weight of authority tempered by what might have been sympathy. I want you to understand the gravity of what we're proposing here. Your brother James stands accused of murdering 3 men in cold blood. The evidence against him is substantial, and the territorial governor himself has taken an interest in this case. Vivian turned from the window, her spine straight despite the fear coursing through her veins. My brother is innocent, Judge Watts. Those men attacked our ranch, they killed our father and burned half our property. James defended what was left of our family. That's not murder, that's survival. The judge exchanged glances with Sheriff Tom Delaney, a weathered man with a grey mustache who had known the Marshall family for 15 years. Delaney's expression held regret, but also the hard pragmatism of a lawman who had seen too much frontier justice to believe in simple answers. The problem, Miss Marshall, the sheriff interjected, is that those 3 men worked for Clayton Voss, and Voss owns half this territory, including the mine that keeps this town alive. He's demanding justice for his men, and he's got the governor's ear. Without some kind of resolution, this whole situation could explode into range war. Vivian's jaw tightened. Clayton Voss was a name spoken with either reverence or fear throughout the Arizona Territory. A cattle baron who had built an empire through a combination of shrewd business sense and ruthless enforcement. His ranch, the Iron Crown, sprawled across thousands of acres. His influence reached into every corner of territorial politics, so my brother hangs to satisfy Clayton Voss's pride. Vivian's voice trembled with barely controlled anger. That's your justice? Judge Watts raised a hand. There may be another way. Voss has agreed to drop the charges and call off his vendetta against your family under one specific condition. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Vivienne felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the judge to continue. Voss has a man in his employ, Watts said carefully. A fighter, a tracker, an Apache warrior who has become a problem that Voss can no longer control. This man's reputation has grown so fearsome that his very presence is destabilizing the territory. Other ranchers fear him. Outlaws avoid areas where he operates. Even Voss's own men refuse to work alongside him. I don't understand, Vivian said. What does an Apache warrior have to do with my brother? Sheriff Delaney stepped forward. The man's Apache name is Machu, which means wolf in their tongue. The whites call him Thaddeus Mercer, a name the mission school gave him when he was a boy. He's been working as Voss's tracker and enforcer for 3 years, and in that time he's killed more than 20 men. All of them in what you might call legal circumstances, defense of property, response to rustlers, that sort of thing. But the violence follows him like a shadow. Vivian felt a chill run down her spine. An Apache warrior. The newspapers back east were filled with stories about Apache raids, about their legendary fighting skills, about Geronimo's resistance that had only ended 5 years ago. The Apache were portrayed as savage, merciless, the embodiment of everything white settlers feared about the frontier. Voss wants him gone, Judge Watts continued. But firing him outright would be dangerous. Mercer knows too much about Voss's operations, things that could bring down the entire Iron Crown Empire if they came to light. Voss needs Mercer controlled, contained, bound to someone who can keep him in check. The implication hit Vivian like a physical blow. "You can't be serious." "Marriage," the judge said bluntly. "Voss is proposing a marriage between you and Thaddeus Mercer. It would serve multiple purposes. First, it would tie Mercer to a respectable family, giving him a stake in white society. Second, it would satisfy the territorial governor's demand that something be done about the violence. And third, it would resolve your brother's situation. Voss drops all charges, your family keeps your ranch, and the territory avoids a range war." Vivienne felt the room spinning. "You're asking me to marry an Apache, a savage, a man who probably learned to kill before he learned to speak English. You're asking me to bind my life to someone who doesn't even belong to our civilization." "We're offering you a choice," Judge Watts said quietly. "Your brother hangs next week, or you accept this arrangement. Those are the only options on the table." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of boots on the wooden boardwalk outside and the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Vivian closed her eyes, thinking of James sitting in a cell 3 buildings away. Her younger brother, barely 20 years old, facing the gallows for defending their home. Their father was already dead, their mother had passed 2 years prior, and their small ranch was all that remained of the Marshall family legacy. "I need to know more about this man," Vivian said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "If I'm going to make this decision, I need to understand who Thaddeus Mercer really is." Sheriff Delaney pulled out a worn folder and laid it on the judge's desk. "What we know comes from various sources. Mercer was born into the Chiricahua Apache, probably around 1851. When he was about 10 years old, he was captured during a cavalry raid on his village. His family was killed. He was sent to a mission school in New Mexico, where they gave him the name Thaddeus Mercer and tried to, as they say, civilize him." "Did it work?" Vivian asked. Delaney's expression was grim. "He learned English, learned to read and write, learned Christian prayers and white man's ways. But something in him never broke. The missionaries said he was their best student and their biggest failure. He could recite scripture perfectly, while his eyes held nothing but rage. When he turned 18, he left the mission," Judge Watts added. "Disappeared into the desert for years. Some say he tried to rejoin his people, but the Apache wouldn't fully accept him. He'd been too changed by the white world. He was caught between cultures, belonging fully to neither. 3 years ago, he showed up at the Iron Crown looking for work." Delaney continued. "Voss hired him as a tracker, thinking his Apache skills would be useful for following cattle thieves. Within a month, Voss realized he'd found something more valuable than a tracker. He'd found a weapon." The sheriff opened the folder and pulled out several reports. "When rustlers hit the Iron Crown herds, Mercer tracked them for 3 days through territory where even the Apache scouts wouldn't go. He brought back the stolen cattle and left the rustlers' bodies arranged in a pattern that the local Apache said was a traditional warning. When claim jumpers tried to take over one of Voss's mining operations, Mercer cleared them out single-handedly. 6 armed men. He walked away without a scratch. He sounds like a monster," Vivian whispered. "He sounds like what the white man's world made him," Judge Watts said unexpectedly. "We took a boy from his people, tried to erase everything he was, then were surprised when we created something we couldn't control. But here's what's interesting, Miss Marshall. In 3 years, despite all the violence, despite all the killings, not one person has ever accused Mercer of cruelty. He doesn't torture, doesn't scalp, doesn't make his victims suffer. He kills quickly and efficiently, like he's completing a task rather than satisfying bloodlust. Some say he hasn't spoken more than 100 words in the last year," Sheriff Delaney added. "The mission school taught him perfect English, but he's chosen silence. He communicates mostly through gestures and the occasional written note. It's like he's rejecting everything the white world tried to force on him." Vivian felt her prejudices warring with curiosity. What broke him? Was it losing his family? The mission school. The judge and sheriff exchanged glances. "We don't know the full story," Watts admitted. "But there was an incident about 4 years ago. Mercer had left the mission and was trying to make his way as a scout for the army. He was good at it, respected even. Then he was assigned to guide a patrol into Apache territory. Delaney took over the story. The commanding officer ignored Mercer's warnings about the area, said he wouldn't take advice from a savage, led his men right into an ambush. 15 soldiers died. Mercer survived because he knew the terrain, knew how to fight like an Apache when he needed to. But the army blamed him for the massacre, said he'd led them into a trap, that he was still loyal to his people despite his white education. They court-martialed him, Vivian asked. They tried, Watts said, but there wasn't enough evidence. Still, his reputation was destroyed. No one would hire him. He was an Apache who couldn't be trusted by whites, and a white-educated Indian who couldn't be trusted by his own people. When Voss finally offered him work with no questions asked, Mercer took it. And he's been Voss's weapon ever since. "You want me to marry this man," Vivian said flatly. "Someone who's been betrayed by both worlds he belongs to. Someone who's chosen violence as his only language because words failed him." "We want you to survive," Judge Watts said with unexpected gentleness. "And we want your brother to survive. This is the only path that allows both those things to happen." Vivian walked back to the window, staring out at Copper Ridge's dusty main street. A wagon rolled past, kicking up clouds of dirt. A woman in a faded dress herded 3 small children toward the general store. 2 cowboys stood outside the saloon, eyeing a group of Mexican vaqueros with casual hostility. Life continued its rough, relentless rhythm in this frontier town, built on stolen Apache land, maintained through violence and prejudice. "I want 3 days," she said, without turning around. 3 days to see this through, to understand what I'm agreeing to before I make my decision. "Miss Marshall," the judge began. 3 days, Vivian repeated firmly, turning to face them. "Let me meet him. Let me see the ranch, the life I would be entering. Let me look into the eyes of this Apache warrior and decide if I can live with what I find there. If I'm going to sacrifice myself for my brother's life, I deserve at least that much." Judge Watts considered for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll send word to Clayton Voss. He'll arrange for Mercer to meet you tomorrow at the Iron Crown. But Miss Marshall, understand this. If you refuse after seeing him, your brother's execution proceeds as scheduled, and nothing will stop it." That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and crimson over the desert mountains, Vivienne sat beside her brother in his cell. James looked thinner than he had a month ago, his face gaunt and his eyes haunted by the memory of the shootout that had killed their father and changed everything. "You can't do this, Vivi," James said, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. "You can't marry some Apache killer just to save me. I'd rather hang than see you bound to a savage." Vivian reached through the bars and gripped her brother's hand. "Don't use that word. He has a name, Thaddeus Mercer. And whatever he is, whatever he's done, he's a human being, not an animal." James pulled his hand away. "He's Apache, Vivi. They're not like us. They don't think like us, don't feel like us. How can you even consider binding yourself to someone so fundamentally different?" "And because I don't have a choice," Vivian said. "Because this is the only way forward that doesn't end with you swinging from a rope. Because maybe, just maybe, there's more to Thaddeus Mercer than the stories suggest. You're trying to convince yourself there's something redeemable in him," James said bitterly. "But what if there isn't? What if he really is the savage everyone says he is? What if being raised by whites didn't change his fundamental nature?" Vivienne stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "Then I'll find a way to survive him. The same way we survived losing Papa and Mama. The same way we survived the attack on our ranch. We're marshals, James. We survive." That night, alone in the small room she had rented above the saloon, Vivienne lay awake, listening to the sounds of Copper Ridge settling into its restless sleep. Piano music drifted up from below, accompanied by rough laughter and the clink of glasses. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. The wind rattled the loose window pane. She thought about her father, who had brought their family west with dreams of building something lasting. She thought about her mother, who had died of pneumonia without ever seeing those dreams fulfilled. She thought about the ranch, that hard-won piece of land that represented everything the Marshalls had fought for. And she thought about Thaddeus Mercer, Marchu, the wolf, an Apache warrior torn from his people as a child, forcibly educated in white ways, then rejected by both worlds. A man who had learned that violence was the only language both cultures understood. A silent killer who somehow held her family's fate in his scarred hands. What kind of man earned a name like the Wolf? What kind of violence had shaped him into someone even Clayton Voss feared to cross? And most troubling of all, what kind of life awaited her if she agreed to bind herself to him? The next morning arrived with the cruel brightness that characterized Arizona Territory days. Vivienne dressed carefully in her best traveling clothes, a dark blue dress that had belonged to her mother, and a bonnet that provided some protection from the relentless sun. Sheriff Delaney had arranged for a wagon to take her to the Iron Crown, a 2-hour journey into the foothills where Voss's empire sprawled across what had once been Apache hunting grounds. "You don't have to do this today," Delaney said as he helped her into the wagon. "You could take more time to think." "More time won't change the reality," Vivienne replied. "It will only make it harder. I need to see him, Sheriff. I need to look into the eyes of the man they call the Wolf and decide if I can live with what I find there." The journey to the Iron Crown took them through some of the most beautiful and unforgiving landscape Vivienne had ever seen. Red rock formations rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor. Saguaro cacti stood with their arms raised as if in perpetual surrender to the sky. In the distance, mountains wavered in the heat shimmer, looking more like mirages than solid earth. This had been Apache land for generations before men like Clayton Voss had claimed it through violence and legal manipulation. Vivienne wondered what Thaddeus Mercer felt, working on land stolen from his people, serving a man who represented everything that had destroyed his world. The Iron Crown ranch house came into view just before noon. It was an imposing structure of adobe and timber, sprawling across a small rise, with corrals and outbuildings spreading in all directions. Cattle dotted the landscape, and Vivienne could see ranch hands working in the distance. Everything about the place spoke of wealth, power, and control. Everything about it was built on Apache land. Clayton Voss himself came out to meet the wagon. He was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the hardness in his eyes. He wore expensive clothes that looked out of place in the dusty ranch setting, and his manner carried the confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "Miss Marshall," Voss said, helping her down from the wagon with exaggerated courtesy. "Welcome to the Iron Crown. I trust your journey was not too uncomfortable?" "It was fine, Mr. Voss," Vivienne replied, keeping her voice neutral. "I understand we have matters to discuss." "Indeed we do," Voss gestured toward the house. "But first I imagine you'd like to meet the man at the center of this arrangement. Thaddeus is working with the horses. He has a gift with them, one of the few useful things his people taught him." The casual racism in Voss's tone made Vivienne's stomach turn, but she said nothing. She followed him away from the main house toward a large corral complex where several horses moved restlessly. "I should warn you," Voss said as they approached. "Thaddeus doesn't speak much. In fact, he may not speak to you at all. The Apache are naturally taciturn, and the mission school never quite civilized that out of him. Don't take it personally. It's simply his nature." They reached the corral fence, and Vivienne saw him. Thaddeus Mercer stood in the center of the corral, working with a young stallion that danced nervously at the end of a lead rope. Even from a distance, Vivienne could see he was different from any man she'd encountered. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean, powerful build of someone who'd survived through strength and skill. His skin was the deep bronze of his Apache heritage, and his long black hair was pulled back with a strip of leather. though a few strands had escaped to frame his face. He wore simple ranch clothes, but they couldn't hide the inherent grace of his movements. He moved like a predator, each gesture deliberate and controlled, yet somehow fluid. As he worked with the horse, speaking softly in what Vivian assumed was Apache, the animal gradually calmed. "Thaddeus," Voss called out. "Come here. Someone I need you to meet." The man turned, and Vivian got her first clear look at his face. He was perhaps 30 years old, with features that were unmistakably Apache. High, prominent cheekbones, a strong aquiline nose, a firm jaw. But it was his eyes that arrested her attention. They were dark, almost black, and they held a depth of pain and rage that struck Vivian like a physical blow. These were eyes that had seen too much, suffered too much, lost too much. A long scar ran from his left temple across his cheek, the kind of wound that came from a blade rather than a bullet. And Vivian noticed other scars visible where his shirt sleeve had been rolled up. These were not random marks. These were deliberate traces of violence, some old and faded, others more recent. This was not the face of a mindless savage. This was the face of someone who had been broken and remade, over and over, until only the hardest parts remained. He walked toward them with that same predatory grace, and Vivian had to force herself not to step back. Everything about him radiated barely contained power, like a thunderstorm on the horizon. "Thaddeus," Voss said. "This is Vivian Marshall. I've explained the situation to her. She's agreed to meet you, to consider the arrangement we discussed." Thaddeus's dark eyes fixed on Vivian, and she felt the intensity of his gaze like heat from a forge. He studied her in complete silence, taking in every detail with an assessment that felt more tactical than personal. He was measuring her, she realized, evaluating whether she was a threat, an ally, or simply another white person who would betray him. After what felt like an eternity, he gave a single nod. Not of greeting, not of approval, simply acknowledgement that she existed, that she was present. "Say something to the lady, Thaddeus," Voss prompted with barely concealed impatience. But Thaddeus said nothing. He simply turned and walked back to the horse he had been working with, dismissing them as completely as if they had never interrupted his work. Voss's jaw tightened. "You'll have to forgive him, Miss Marshall. As I said, he's not much for conversation. The Apache aren't known for their social graces," but Vivian was already walking toward the corral fence. Something in his silence spoke louder than words could have. This was not rudeness or contempt. This was protection. This was a man who had learned that words could betray, that silence was safer than speech, especially when speaking in the language of the people who had destroyed his world. She stopped at the fence, watching as he ran his hands along the horse's neck with surprising gentleness. The animal, which had been skittish moments before, leaned into his touch with obvious trust. "What's his name?" Vivian asked quietly. Thaddeus didn't look at her, but after a moment he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He wrote something and held it up without meeting her eyes. "Ghost." "That's a good name," Vivian said. "He's beautiful. You have a gift with horses." Another pause. Then Thaddeus wrote again. "Animals don't lie, don't betray. They are what they are." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. This was a man who had been lied to and betrayed so many times that he trusted animals more than people. "Mr. Mercer," Vivian said, and for the first time, those dark eyes focused directly on her. "I'm here because your employer has made my family an offer. My brother's life in exchange for a marriage between us. I have 3 days to decide whether to accept." Something flickered in those black eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. He'd been traded and bartered before, passed from his Apache family to white missionaries, to the army to Voss. One more transaction shouldn't surprise him. "I need to understand who you are," Vivian continued. "Not the stories, not the reputation. I need to know the man I would be binding my life to. Will you help me understand?" For a long moment Thaddeus simply stared at her. Then he reached for the paper again and wrote carefully before showing it to her. "You should refuse. I'm not worth your sacrifice. White woman should not be bound to Apache. Your people will hate you. Mine will never accept you. You will be as caught between worlds as I am." The words hit Vivian harder than any threat could have. This was not arrogance or false modesty. This was genuine concern. Despite everything he'd suffered, despite all the reasons he had to be bitter and cruel, Thaddeus Mercer was trying to protect her from the consequences of this arrangement. "That's not your decision to make," Vivian said firmly. "It's mine, but I can't make it without information. Without truth." Thaddeus lowered the paper, his jaw working as if he were fighting some internal battle. Finally he wrote again, 3 days. I will show you what I am, what my life is. Then you will understand why you should run as far from this place as you can." The 3 days that followed would shatter every assumption Vivian had carried west from Boston, every prejudice she'd absorbed from newspapers and Sunday sermons, every comfortable lie white society told itself about the people whose land they'd stolen. Clayton Voss had arranged for Vivian to stay in one of the guest rooms at the Iron Crown's main house, a space decorated with artifacts that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Apache baskets hung on the walls as decoration. A ceremonial shield that had probably been taken from a dead warrior served as wall art. Voss displayed the culture he'd helped destroy like hunting trophies, but luxury meant nothing when she knew the price attached to it. Every comfort in this house had been bought with blood and theft, including the labor of the man she was supposed to marry. That first evening, Voss insisted she dine with him in the main house. The meal was elaborate, far beyond what most frontier households could manage. As they ate, Voss held forth on his views about the territory, about progress and civilization. The Apache had this land for generations, Voss said, cutting into an expensive cut of beef. But they did nothing with it. No development, no agriculture worth mentioning. They simply wandered, hunting and raiding. It took men of vision to see what this land could become. Men of vision, Vivian repeated carefully, or men with guns and government backing. Voss's eyes narrowed slightly. Progress always requires force, Miss Marshall. The strong inherit the earth. That's biblical truth as much as natural law. The Apache were warriors, yes, but they were also primitives, unable to adapt to the changing world. And Thaddeus Mercer, Vivian asked. He adapted. Learned English, learned your ways, yet you still treat him as something less than human. Thaddeus is useful, Voss replied bluntly. He has skills that serve my purposes, but useful doesn't mean equal. An Apache raised by missionaries is still an Apache at his core. You can teach a wolf to perform tricks, but it remains a wolf. The casual dehumanization made Vivian's blood boil, but she kept her expression neutral. She was beginning to understand the trap she was walking into. Voss didn't want to civilize Thaddeus through this marriage. He wanted to humiliate him, to demonstrate that even an Apache warrior could be conquered and controlled. After dinner, unable to sleep, Vivian walked out onto the veranda. The desert night was cold, stars blazing overhead with an intensity she'd never seen back east. She was staring at the constellations when a voice spoke from the shadows. "You're the woman Voss wants to marry off to the Apache." Vivian turned to find an older Mexican woman emerging into the lamplight. She had silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that held both wisdom and weariness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "I'm Maria Gonzalez," the woman said. "I manage the household here, have for 15 years. You must be Vivian Marshall. News travels fast," Vivian observed. Maria leaned against the railing. "In a place like this, everyone knows everything, especially when it concerns Thaddeus. The ranch hands talk about little else. Half are terrified of him, the other half respect him more than they'd ever admit. What do you think of him?" Vivian asked. Maria was quiet for a moment. "I think he's the loneliest man I've ever known. And I think Voss is a fool for not seeing what he really has. What does he have?" "Loyalty," Maria said simply. Despite everything, despite all the reasons Thaddeus has to hate every white person he meets, he keeps his word. When Voss gives him a job, he completes it. When he makes a promise, he keeps it. That kind of integrity is rare. She paused, studying Vivian. But you should know what you're walking into. This marriage won't just bind you to Thaddeus. It'll make you an outcast. White society will shun you for marrying an Apache. The Apache who remain will hate you as a symbol of everything they've lost. You'll exist in the space between, belonging nowhere. Thaddeus told me the same thing, Vivian said quietly. Then he was being honest, Maria replied. More honest than Voss has been. The rancher sees this arrangement as a way to control Thaddeus, to break whatever spirit the missions didn't crush. But what Voss doesn't understand is that Thaddeus stopped breaking years ago. Now he just endures. They stood in silence for a while. Finally, Vivian asked the question that had been haunting her. Why does he stay? Why work for a man who sees him as barely human? Maria's laugh was bitter. Where else would he go? Back to a reservation where his own people see him as contaminated by white education. To a town where he'd be refused service and threatened with violence. At least here, doing Voss's dirty work, he has purpose, has a place, however dark that place might be. The next morning, Vivian woke before dawn with a plan. She dressed in the most practical clothes she'd brought, borrowed a pair of riding boots from Maria, and made her way to the corrals before the sun had fully risen. Thaddeus was already there, working with Ghost and 2 other horses. In the early morning light, she could see him more clearly. The way he moved with such economy of motion, nothing wasted. The gentle patience he showed the animals, and the visible tension in his shoulders, as if he expected an attack from any direction at any moment. When he noticed her, he didn't stop his work. But after a few minutes, he secured the horses and turned to face her. Up close, she could see more details. The laugh lines around his eyes suggested he'd once smiled more than he did now. A small scar on his chin that looked older than the others, probably from childhood. And the way his hands moved constantly, never quite still, as if readiness for violence had become so ingrained he couldn't turn it off. I want to see where you live, Vivian said, without preamble. Your space. If I'm going to make this decision, I need to understand your life beyond what Voss shows me. Thaddeus studied her for a long moment, surprise flickering across his usually impassive face. Then he gestured for her to follow. They walked in silence past the main ranch complex to a small adobe structure set apart from everything else. It was barely more than a shed, with a single door and 1 small window. The isolation was deliberate, Vivian realized. Voss kept his Apache enforcer separated from the white ranch hands. Inside was even more sparse than she'd expected. A narrow cot with a single blanket, a small table with 1 chair, a wood stove. No decorations except for a few items that made Vivian's breath catch. A piece of woven basketwork in traditional Apache patterns, a small leather pouch that hung from a peg, probably containing sacred objects, a flute carved from wood, and books. A surprising number of books stacked carefully in the corner. Vivian moved closer and saw titles that shocked her. The Bible in English and what looked like Apache. Classical literature, Shakespeare and Homer. Technical manuals on tracking and survival. And journals, at least a dozen of them, their leather covers worn from use. You read? Vivian said, unable to hide her surprise. Thaddeus reached for paper and pencil. The missionaries taught reading to replace our oral traditions. They wanted to kill our stories by giving us yours. But I learned to love words anyway. On pages I can speak without judgment, without fear. May I? Vivian asked, gesturing to one of the journals. He hesitated, then handed her the most recent one. His handwriting was precise, almost beautiful, each letter formed with care. The first entry she saw was dated 2 weeks ago. Voss wants me to marry a white woman. Another transaction, another way to control what he cannot understand. I should refuse. Should tell him to find another weapon to wield. But I am tired of fighting battles that cannot be won. And perhaps this woman, whoever she is, deserves better than to die because her brother made enemies of powerful men. I remember my mother's hands weaving baskets, my father teaching me to track deer through canyon country. My sisters laughed when I would tell stories. The missionaries said those memories made me savage. That civilization meant forgetting, becoming something new. But you cannot carve away memory like flesh from bone. It remains, aching like a phantom limb. Sometimes I wonder if I died in that cavalry raid when I was 10. If this life is just a ghost walking through a world that has no place for what I am. Vivian looked up, tears stinging her eyes. You write like a poet, not a killer. Thaddeus took the journal back, writing quickly. I am both. The same hands that write these words have taken lives. The same mind that loves Shakespeare knows 50 ways to kill a man silently. The mission school made me this contradiction. What was your life like? Vivian asked. Before the cavalry came. Before everything changed. He stared at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she deserved an answer. Then he began writing, pages and pages, occasionally pausing to find the right words. My Apache name is Machu. Wolf. Given to me when I was 8, because I could track and move silently like the animal. Our band lived in the Chiricahua Mountains, moving with the seasons. My father was a respected warrior. My mother was known for her basket weaving and her knowledge of medicinal plants. I had a sister, Narlin. She was 6 when the cavalry came. I remember she was wearing a dress my mother had made, decorated with beads traded from the Mexicans. She was playing with a doll carved from wood when the shooting started. The soldiers came at dawn. We tried to run, but they had surrounded our camp during the night. My father fought to give us time to escape. I saw him fall with 3 bullets in his chest. My mother pushed me behind rocks and told me to run. When I looked back, the soldiers had her. I never saw her again. Naylin and I hid in a crevice between rocks. We stayed there all day, listening to gunfire and screaming. When night came, I tried to lead her away, but the soldiers had dogs. They found us before we'd gone 2 miles. A young lieutenant pulled me from the rocks. He had kind eyes, I remember that. He said they were taking us to a mission school. Said we'd be cared for, educated. He said it was for our own good. Then he shot Nolan in the head. She was too young for the mission, he said. Too much trouble. He shot her like she was a wounded animal that needed to be put down. That lieutenant's name was William Carver. I learned to read so I could track him through army records. I'd learned to write so I could document his crimes. But by the time I had the skills to find him, he had died of fever in Texas. I never got justice for Narlin. Vivian was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face as she read. The casual horror of it, the matter-of-fact way Thaddeus described atrocity, made it somehow worse. This wasn't dramatic storytelling. This was simply his life. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so deeply sorry. Thaddeus wrote one more line. Your sorrow changes nothing. This is what made me. The mission school tried to teach me to forgive, to turn the other cheek. But how do you forgive men who murder children and call it progress? Vivian set the journal down carefully. Is that why you don't speak? Because the language they taught you is the same language they used to justify killing your family. Thaddeus nodded slowly, then wrote, Every English word in my mouth tastes like ash, like betrayal of everything I lost. So I speak only when necessary. Only when silence would cost more than speech. But you speak to the horses, Vivian observed. I heard you this morning. What language was that? Apache. With animals I can be what I was meant to be. Not the mission school's creation. Not Voss's weapon. Just Machu. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the ranch was coming alive with the sounds of men working. But inside this small adobe room, insulated from the world that had broken him, Thaddeus seemed more at peace than Vivian had yet seen him. Show me more, Vivian said finally. Show me your life here, not what Voss wants me to see. The truth. Over the next 2 days, Thaddeus became her guide to a reality she'd never imagined. He took her to meet the Mexican vaqueros who worked the farthest corners of Voss's land, men who treated Thaddeus with cautious respect rather than fear. He showed her the places in the desert where Apache had once camped, pointing out grinding stones and fire pits that white settlers ignored or destroyed. He taught her to read tracks, to find water in seemingly barren landscape, to understand the language of wind and birds. And slowly, carefully, he began to speak aloud more often. Short phrases in English, longer sentences in Apache that he would then translate on paper. "Why are you showing me all this?" Vivienne asked on the second evening as they sat on a ridge watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke aloud, his voice was rough but clear. "Because if you agree to this marriage, you should know what you're agreeing to. Not Voss's version, not the legend, the truth." "And what is the truth?" Vivienne asked. "That I am broken in ways that cannot be fixed," Thaddeus said. "That I live between worlds, welcomed by neither. That the violence I've done in Voss's service has marked me permanently. That marrying me will make you an outcast from your own people." He paused, searching for words. "But also that I am not the savage your people believe me to be. That I value honor and loyalty even when they've brought me nothing but pain. That I remember beauty even after seeing so much ugliness. That some small part of me still believes in something beyond survival." "What do you believe in?" Vivienne asked softly. Thaddeus looked at her directly, his dark eyes reflecting the dying light. "I believe that we don't get to choose what breaks us, only how we carry the broken pieces." That evening back at the ranch, Vivienne made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been walking near Voss's office when she heard voices through the partially open window. Voss and one of his foremen discussing something they clearly thought was private. "The Marshall situation is working out perfectly," Voss was saying. "Once the girl marries the Apache, I'll have leverage over both of them. She won't dare step out of line knowing I can make her life hell. And Thaddeus will be too worried about protecting her to cause me problems." "What about after the marriage?" the foreman asked. "You really think having her here will civilize him?" Voss laughed. "I don't care about civilizing him. I care about controlling him. A man with a wife has something to lose. Makes him predictable, manageable, and if he does become a problem, well, accidents happen on ranches, especially to half-breed squaws and their white wives." The casual threat made Vivienne's blood run cold. She hurried away before they could discover her eavesdropping, her mind racing. This wasn't about resolution or peace. This was about power and control. Voss was using her as another tool to dominate Thaddeus, but more than that, she'd heard something else in Voss's words. A reference to other problems, other people Voss had eliminated, including possibly her father. She found Thaddeus in his small adobe room, writing in his journal by lamplight. When she entered without knocking, he looked up in surprise. "I need to tell you something," Vivienne said urgently. "About why I'm really here. About what Clayton Voss has done." She told him everything. About her father's investigation into Voss's criminal activities. About the attack on their ranch that she believed Voss had ordered. About James being used as leverage. And about what she'd just overheard. Thaddeus listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he reached for his paper and wrote with violent intensity, "You're saying Voss killed your father, and now he's using you to control both me and your brother. This marriage is a trap for all of us." "Yes," Vivienne confirmed, "but it's also an opportunity. If we're smart, if we work together, we can use this trap against him." Thaddeus stared at her. "What are you proposing?" Vivienne took a deep breath. "I'm proposing we go through with the marriage, but not as Voss's pawns. As allies, partners, we make him think he's won, that he's successfully caged both of us. But really, we gather evidence against him. We find proof of his crimes, and we bring him down." She leaned forward. "You know things about Voss's operations. You've done jobs for him, seen things, heard things. And I have my father's investigative skills. Together we could build a case that even his political connections couldn't protect him from." Thaddeus was shaking his head before she finished. He wrote quickly, "You don't know what you're asking. Investigating Voss means risking everything. Your life, your brother's life, any chance at safety. And for what? Justice? Revenge? Those words mean nothing against a man with Voss's power. They mean everything, Vivian countered. My father died believing in justice, believing that truth matters, that powerful men should answer for their crimes. If I don't at least try to finish what he started, then his death meant nothing. She grabbed Thaddeus's hand, ignoring his flinch at the contact. You understand what it means to lose everything, to have your family torn away by men who face no consequences. Don't you want to see Voss pay for what he's done? Not just to my family, but to yours? This ranch sits on Apache land, your people's land. Voss built his empire on their graves. Thaddeus pulled his hand away, standing and moving to the small window. For a long time, he stared out at the desert that had once belonged to his people. When he finally turned back, something had shifted in his expression. If we do this, he said aloud, the words coming slowly but with conviction, if we actually try to bring down Voss, there's no going back. We'd be declaring war on the most powerful man in the territory. He'd use every resource to destroy us. I know, Vivian said. You could die. Your brother could die. I would almost certainly die. Is justice worth that price? It's not just justice, Vivian said passionately. It's accountability. It's making sure that men like Voss can't keep destroying lives without consequence. It's honoring everyone he's hurt, including your family. Including mine. Thaddeus studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pencil and wrote one final line. If you're serious about this, if you really want to take on Voss, then yes, I'll help you. Not as his enforcer, not as the wolf, but as Ma Chu, son of murdered Apache, seeking justice for all who've been wronged by men like him. Vivian felt tears of relief. So we're agreed? We go through with the marriage, but on our terms? Agreed, Thaddeus said aloud. But understand this, Vivian. If we do this, I won't let you die for it. Whatever happens, whatever we discover, I'll make sure you survive. I've already failed to protect my family. I won't fail again. We protect each other, Vivian insisted. Both of us survive or neither of us do. Thaddeus almost smiled, a ghost of expression that transformed his harsh features. You're either very brave or very foolish. Both, Vivian admitted. Definitely both. They stood in the lamplight, two broken people from different worlds, agreeing to an alliance that would either save them or destroy them. Outside, the desert night pressed close, full of dangers, seen and unseen. But inside this small adobe room, something unexpected was taking root. Not love, not yet, but understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement that sometimes the only way to survive is to stop surviving alone. The wedding took place 5 days later, under circumstances that made a mockery of sacred ceremony. The small church in Copper Ridge had never witnessed such a gathering. White settlers filling one side of the aisle, while a handful of Mexican workers and displaced Apache occupied the other. The divide between them as stark as a canyon, carved through stone. Vivienne stood before the altar in a simple cream-colored dress that had belonged to her mother, her hands clutching a bouquet of desert wildflowers that Maria had gathered before dawn. The flowers were already wilting in the oppressive heat, their petals curling inward as if trying to protect themselves from what was coming. Thaddeus stood beside her in clothes that looked foreign on his frame, a dark suit that Voss had insisted he wear. His long black hair was pulled back severely, revealing the full extent of his scars. He looked like a man attending his own execution, his face a mask of stoic resignation. Judge Watts presided with an expression of grim satisfaction, pleased that his diplomatic solution had been accepted. Sheriff Delaney sat in the front pew as witness, his weathered face troubled. Clayton Voss occupied a prominent position, watching the proceedings with barely concealed triumph. This was his victory, his demonstration that even an Apache warrior could be broken and controlled. The church was otherwise nearly empty. James had refused to attend, unable to watch his sister bind herself to what he called a savage. Most of Copper Ridge's respectable citizens had also stayed away, unwilling to witness what they considered an abomination. Only the curious and the cruel had come, drawn by the spectacle of watching a white woman marry an Apache. As Judge Watts droned through the ceremony, reciting words about duty and commitment that felt hollow in this context, Vivienne noticed the reactions around them. An older woman in the back made the sign of the cross, as if warding off evil. Two young cowboys whispered to each other, their expressions mixing contempt and fascination. A Mexican woman dabbed at her eyes, moved by something the others couldn't see. "Do you, Vivienne Catherine Marshall, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Vivienne looked at Thaddeus, at the man who would now be bound to her by law and circumstance. His dark eyes met hers, and she saw in them the same determination she felt. They were entering this marriage as conspirators, as allies against a common enemy. It wasn't love, but it was partnership. It was purpose. "I do," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent church. Judge Watts turned to Thaddeus. "And do you, Thaddeus Michael Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" The silence stretched. Vivienne felt every eye in the church fixed on Thaddeus, waiting to see if the Apache would speak, if he would participate in this white ceremony or maintain his defiant silence. Thaddeus's jaw worked. His hands clenched at his sides. Vivienne could see the internal struggle, generations of pain and resistance warring with his promise to her. "I do," he said finally, his voice rough but audible. The Apache words came first, barely a whisper, then the English. "Ncha, I do." A ripple of reaction moved through the church. Some looked shocked that he'd spoken at all. Others seemed offended that he'd used his native language in a Christian ceremony. But Vivienne understood. He was claiming this moment, making it partly his, even as everything else was being taken from him. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Watts declared, his discomfort evident. "You may seal the union." Thaddeus turned to Vivienne, uncertainty crossing his face. They hadn't discussed this part. But Vivienne made the decision for both of them, reaching up to place a gentle kiss on his cheek, just beside the long scar. His skin was warm beneath her lips, and she felt him tense before very slowly relaxing. The ceremony was over. Vivienne was now Mrs. Thaddeus Mercer, bound to an Apache warrior by law. There was no celebration, no reception. Judge Watts filed the paperwork with bureaucratic efficiency. Leighton Voss shook Thaddeus's hand with proprietorial satisfaction, a rancher pleased with a successful business transaction. And just like that, Vivienne's old life ended. They traveled to the Marshall Ranch that same afternoon in a wagon loaded with Vivienne's possessions and the few items Thaddeus had brought from his small adobe room. As they left Copper Ridge behind, Vivienne noticed people watching from windows and doorways. Some faces showed pity, others disgust, a few genuine curiosity. "They think I've ruined myself," Vivienne said quietly as the town disappeared behind them. "You have," Thaddeus replied, his voice still rough from disuse. "In their eyes, you're no longer a respectable white woman. You're something else now, something they don't have a name for. What about in Apache eyes?" Vivienne asked. Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. "To the Apache who remain, you're a white woman who married one of their own. Some will see it as betrayal on my part, choosing the enemy. Others will see it as confirmation that I was never truly Apache. Just a white man's creation wearing Apache skin, so we're both outcasts," Vivienne observed. "We were already outcasts," Thaddeus corrected. "This just makes it official." The Marshall Ranch came into view as the sun began its descent. The small house looked weather-beaten but sturdy. The barn that Voss's men had burned during the attack was a blackened shell. The corrals needed repairs, and the whole property had an air of neglect from weeks without proper care. Thaddeus brought the wagon to a stop and surveyed the land with a tracker's practiced eye. Vivienne watched him take in the defensive position of the house on its slight rise. The water access from the nearby creek, the sight lines to the surrounding territory. "Your father chose well," Thaddeus said, climbing down from the wagon. "Good position, defensible. Apache would approve." They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading and settling in. The house was dusty from weeks of abandonment, but Maria had sent cleaning supplies and fresh linens. As Vivian worked on making the interior habitable, she became aware of Thaddeus moving through the property with purpose. She found him examining the burned barn, running his hands over the charred wood and studying the patterns of destruction. His expression had grown dark. "What is it?" she asked. "This fire was set deliberately," Thaddeus said, pointing to multiple origin points. 3 different places, meant to ensure complete destruction. "Professional work, Voss's men," Vivian said bitterly. Thaddeus nodded. "The same men who attacked when your father was killed. I tracked them once, weeks ago. Voss sent me to retrieve some horses they'd stolen from the Iron Crown. I knew their boot prints. Their patterns," he paused, his jaw tightening. "I helped Voss recover his property, while these same men had already murdered your father." "You didn't know," Vivian said firmly. "That's what I keep telling myself," Thaddeus replied. "But ignorance doesn't absolve guilt. I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why Voss needed so many violent men in his employ." They worked in silence as the sun set, each lost in their own thoughts about complicity and responsibility. When darkness fell, they found themselves sitting on the porch, exhausted from the day's physical and emotional labor. "We need to start gathering evidence," Vivian said, breaking the silence. "Build a case against Voss that's so strong even his political connections can't save him." Thaddeus pulled out paper and pencil, writing by the faint light from inside the house. "First priority is documenting Voss's criminal activities. I've witnessed many things over 3 years. Intimidation, theft, violence, but witnessing isn't proof. We need documents, ledgers, correspondence, things that can stand up in court." "My father must have found something," Vivian said. "Something concrete enough that Voss felt threatened. We need to search the property, find whatever evidence he hid. Where would he hide something he wanted to protect, but also access easily?" Vivian closed her eyes, trying to think like her father. He'd been methodical, paranoid after their experience in Boston. He'd known he was putting himself in danger. "The printing press," she said suddenly. "My father had a small press in the barn. He used it for ranch documents and flyers, but it was also his most prized possession. Something he'd brought all the way from Boston." "The barn burned," Thaddeus wrote, "but the press was iron and steel," Vivian said, standing quickly. "It might have survived." They grabbed lanterns and hurried to the burned barn. The structure was a skeleton of charred timbers and collapsed roof, but in the corner where her father had kept his press, the heavy iron frame still stood, blackened by fire but intact. Thaddeus circled the press carefully, examining every component by lantern light. His tracker's instincts, honed over a lifetime, caught details Vivian would have missed. After several minutes, he pointed to a section of the base that looked slightly different from the rest. "Here," he said aloud. "Modified, not original construction." Working together, they managed to loosen the bolts holding the section in place. When they finally pulled it free, Vivian's breath caught. Behind the false panel was a hollow space, and inside that space was a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. With trembling hands, Vivian pulled out the box and opened it. Inside were documents that made her gasp. Ledgers showing payments from Voss to corrupt officials. Correspondence between Voss and known criminals. Detailed notes in her father's handwriting documenting murders, theft, and systematic intimidation. Witness statements from people too afraid to testify publicly. And photographs, damning images of Voss meeting with men wanted by federal marshals. "Oh, Papa," Vivian whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You found it all. You documented everything." Thaddeus was examining the documents with intense focus. As he read, his expression grew darker. "This isn't just about your father's murder," he said quietly. "Voss has committed crimes that stretch back 15 years. Including the massacre of an Apache camp on the Gila River." He held up a document, his hand shaking slightly. "I knew about this massacre. Everyone did. Cavalry claimed it was retaliation for raids, but Apache elders said the camp was peaceful. Women and children were killed. The army investigated but declared the action justified. "What does the document say?" Vivian asked. "It's a letter from Voss to the cavalry commander," Thaddeus said, his voice tight with suppressed rage, "offering payment if the Apache camp was eliminated. The land they occupied had water rights Voss wanted. He paid to have them murdered, then claimed their land when no one was left to contest it." Vivian saw something break in Thaddeus's eyes. "Did you know people in that camp?" "My mother's cousin lived there," Thaddeus said quietly. "She survived the cavalry raid that took my family, only to die in Voss's massacre 5 years later. I've been working for the man who paid to have her killed." The weight of revelation hung heavy between them. They sat in the ruins of the burned barn, surrounded by evidence of systematic evil, understanding finally the full scope of what they were up against. "We can't just take this to local authorities," Vivian said. "Voss owns half of them. We need federal intervention. Someone beyond his reach." "Captain Bennett," Thaddeus wrote. "The cavalry officer at Fort Benton. He's one of the few honest men I've encountered. Has connections to the territorial governor and federal marshal service. How do we get this to him without Voss finding out?" Vivian asked. "I'll take it. Voss expects me to do jobs for him occasionally. I'll tell him I'm tracking rustlers near Fort Benton. Give me 3 days to ride there and back." "That's dangerous," Vivian protested. "If anyone intercepts you, if Voss suspects—" "Everything about this is dangerous," Thaddeus said aloud. "But we knew that when we agreed to this alliance." Over the following days, they developed a careful routine designed to appear normal to anyone watching. Thaddeus worked on repairing the ranch, while Vivian managed the household and began the process of reopening her father's newspaper. To outside observers, they were simply a newly married couple trying to build a life together. But in the evenings, after the sun set and they could work by lamplight behind closed shutters, they pored over the evidence. They created copies of the most crucial documents, hiding originals in multiple locations around the property. They drafted a comprehensive report that laid out Voss's crimes in meticulous detail. During this time, something unexpected began to develop between them. The marriage of convenience started feeling less like a transaction and more like a genuine partnership. Thaddeus taught Vivian to shoot with deadly accuracy, insisting she needed to defend herself when he wasn't present. He showed her how to read the landscape, how to spot danger before it arrived. He shared stories of Apache traditions, speaking his native language more frequently as he grew comfortable with her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. For her part, Vivian drew Thaddeus out in ways no one else had managed. She asked about his childhood before the cavalry came, about his mother's basket weaving and his father's teachings. She read to him in the evenings from books they both enjoyed, her voice filling the silence he'd maintained for so long. One evening, about 2 weeks into their marriage, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. Vivian was exhausted from helping Thaddeus rebuild a section of corral. Her hands blistered despite the gloves she'd worn. Without thinking, she leaned against his shoulder, seeking comfort in his solid presence. She felt him tense, then slowly relax. His arm came up hesitantly, settling around her shoulders in an embrace that felt both awkward and genuine. "Thank you," Vivian said quietly, "for agreeing to this, for helping me, for being more than the legend everyone fears." Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. In Apache culture, we have a saying, "Shikis deehi," it means "my friend," but the direct translation is closer to "one who walks beside me." That's what you've become, Vivian. Someone who walks beside me rather than behind or ahead. "I like that," Vivian said. "Shikis deehi." Her pronunciation was terrible, but Thaddeus smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually stern face. Close enough. They sat like that until the stars emerged, neither wanting to break the moment of connection. For the first time since her father's death, Vivian felt something like peace. And beside her, she could feel Thaddeus's tension gradually easing, as if he too was finding some measure of calm. But peace in the Arizona Territory was always temporary. The trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Clayton Voss himself rode up to the ranch with 4 of his men. Vivian was working in the small garden she'd started when she heard the horses. Thaddeus emerged from the barn, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he now kept close. "Thaddeus, Mrs. Mercer," Voss called out with false joviality. "I hope I'm not interrupting domestic bliss. What do you want, Voss?" Vivian asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Voss dismounted, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Business, I'm afraid. There's been an incident near the territorial border. Some Apache renegades have been hitting supply trains. The army wants them tracked and eliminated. They specifically requested our friend Thaddeus here." Thaddeus pulled out his paper and wrote, "I'm working on the ranch." "Send someone else." "The army doesn't want someone else," Voss said, his voice hardening. "They want the wolf. They want the Apache who knows how other Apache think. And I've agreed to loan you to them for this operation. You can't just order him around like property," Vivian protested. Voss's expression grew cold. "Actually, Mrs. Mercer, I can. Your brother is alive and free because of my generosity. The charges against him are suspended, not dismissed. One word from me and James swings. So when I need Thaddeus for a job, he goes. Those were the terms of our arrangement." The threat hung ugly in the air. Vivian felt rage building in her chest, but Thaddeus placed a warning hand on her arm. A reminder to be careful, to not reveal their true purpose. "How long?" Thaddeus asked aloud, the words clipped. "A week, maybe 2, Voss replied. "Track the renegades, coordinate with the army patrol, eliminate the threat." "Standard work." Thaddeus nodded slowly, and Vivian realized he had no choice. Refusing would raise suspicion, make Voss wonder what they were doing that was so important he couldn't leave. "Fine," Vivian said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "But he comes back here when it's done. No extensions, no additional assignments." Voss tipped his hat mockingly. "Of course, Mrs. Mercer. Thaddeus, be ready to ride at dawn tomorrow. The army patrol is waiting at Fort Apache." After Voss and his men rode away, Vivian turned to Thaddeus with frustration evident on her face. "We can't keep doing this. Every time he snaps his fingers, you have to jump. It's going to interfere with everything we're trying to accomplish," Thaddeus wrote quickly. "I know. But Fort Apache is near Fort Benton. I can deliver the evidence to Captain Bennett while I'm supposedly tracking renegades. This might actually work in our favor, or it might get you killed," Vivian said. "If Voss suspects what you're carrying, if any of his informants see you talking to Bennett, I'll be careful," Thaddeus said aloud. "I've survived worse than this." That evening, they worked late into the night, finalizing their report and preparing a secure package for Captain Bennett. Thaddeus would carry it hidden among his tracking gear, disguised as nothing more than personal supplies. "Come back safe," Vivian said as they finished sealing the package. "Come back to me." Thaddeus looked up, something shifting in his dark eyes. "These past weeks," he said slowly, "living here with you, working beside you, sharing our plans and our past. It's been the closest to peace I've felt since I was 10 years old." He reached out hesitantly and took her hand. "I need you to know. If something goes wrong, if I don't come back, the evidence is hidden in 3 locations around the property. Behind the loose board in the bedroom, buried under the oak tree by the creek, and in the false bottom of my saddlebag, which will be in the barn." "You're coming back," Vivian said fiercely. "I won't accept any other outcome." Thaddeus pulled her closer, and for the first time they embraced fully. Vivian felt his heart beating against her chest, felt the strength in his arms and the gentleness in how he held her. When he spoke again, his lips were close to her ear. "In Apache tradition," he whispered, "when a warrior goes into battle, his wife gives him something to carry for protection, not for its power, but as a reminder of what he's fighting for." Vivian pulled back slightly and reached up to unclasp the small locket she wore, the one containing her mother's portrait. "Take this," she said, pressing it into his hand. "Bring it back to me." Bring yourself back to me." Thaddeus closed his fingers around the locket, his eyes intense. "I promise," he said, "on everything I am, everything I've lost, everything I hope we might build together. I promise I'll return." The next morning, Vivian woke before dawn to find Thaddeus already dressed and preparing Ghost for the journey. She'd packed supplies the night before, including the carefully concealed package for Captain Bennett. As he prepared to leave, Thaddeus did something that surprised her. He spoke in Apache, a long phrase she didn't understand, but that sounded almost like a prayer. Then he translated, "I said, 'May the wind guide my path back to the one who waits.' It's what Apache warriors say to their wives before a dangerous journey." "Then I say the same to you," Vivian replied. "In English, and in whatever Apache words you can teach me." Thaddeus smiled and taught her the phrase. Her pronunciation was rough, but the intent was clear. They stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, two people from irreconcilably different worlds who had somehow found common ground. Then he mounted Ghost and rode away into the lightening sky, carrying with him evidence that could destroy Clayton Voss and change the territory forever. Vivienne watched until he disappeared from view. One hand pressed to her chest where her mother's locket had hung. The ranch felt achingly empty without him. For 3 days, Vivienne threw herself into work, trying not to think about the dangers Thaddeus might be facing. She repaired fences, tended the garden, and began sorting through her father's printing equipment that had survived the fire. But every sound made her look up, hoping to see a rider on the horizon. On the 4th morning, a visitor arrived. Not Thaddeus, but James, her brother. He rode up slowly, his face a mixture of shame and determination. Vivian met him at the porch, surprised by his presence. "I came to apologize," James said without dismounting, "for not attending your wedding, for calling him a savage, for letting my prejudices matter more than supporting my sister. What changed your mind?" Vivian asked carefully. James finally climbed down from his horse. "Sheriff Delaney told me some things. About Thaddeus's past. About what the cavalry did to his family. About how he was just a boy when they took everything from him." He paused. "It made me think about Papa, about how we felt when those men killed him. If someone had offered me a chance to become a weapon against the people who did that, would I have taken it?" "The answer is yes," James continued. "I would have done exactly what Thaddeus did. Become whatever I needed to become to survive. So maybe he's not the savage. Maybe the savages are the ones who create men like him and then fear what they've made." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for saying that. For understanding. I want to help," James said. "With the ranch, with whatever you're planning. I know you didn't marry him just to save me. I know there's more going on. So let me help." Over the next hours, Vivian made a decision. She told James everything. About their investigation into Voss, about the evidence their father had gathered, about the alliance she'd formed with Thaddeus to bring down the man who destroyed both their families. James listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "So, while I was sitting in a cell feeling sorry for myself," James said when she finished, "you were preparing for war against the most powerful man in the territory." "Not war," Vivienne corrected. "Justice. There's a difference. Not much of one when the man you're seeking justice against has an army of hired guns," James replied. "But I'm in. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. You're my sister. You saved my life. Now let me help protect yours." They spent the afternoon fortifying the ranch's defenses. James had learned some hard lessons during his time fighting off Voss's men. He showed Vivian weak points in their property's security and helped her address them. They repositioned supplies for better access during an emergency. They established escape routes and fallback positions. "You really think Voss will come after you directly?" James asked as they worked. "Once he realizes we're moving against him, yes," Vivian said. "Men like Voss don't just accept defeat. They strike back hard and fast." As if summoned by her words, trouble arrived the next morning. Not Voss himself, but one of his foremen, a hard-eyed man named Garrett, who'd been present at several of the incidents documented in their evidence. "Mrs. Mercer," Garrett said, not bothering to dismount, "Mr. Voss sent me to check on the property." Make sure everything's in order while your husband is away. Everything's fine, Vivian replied coldly. You can report back to Voss that we don't need his concern. Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. Wasn't asking permission, ma'am. Voss owns half this territory, including water rights that feed your creek. He's within his rights to inspect his property. This isn't his property, James said, stepping out from the barn with a rifle held casually but pointedly. It's martial land. Has been for 3 years, and you're trespassing. Garrett's hand moved toward his pistol, but he was outnumbered. 3 more men had emerged from various positions around the property, Mexican vaqueros who'd been quietly working the ranch borders. Men Thaddeus had hired before he left, men loyal to him rather than Voss. Tell your boss we know what he's doing, Vivian said firmly. The intimidation won't work. We're not selling, we're not leaving, and we're not afraid of him. Garrett's expression grew ugly. You should be afraid, Mrs. Mercer, you and that Apache you married. Voss has ways of dealing with problems, permanent ways. Then he'll have to deal with us, James said. Now, get off our property before we forget to be civilized about it. After Garrett rode away, Vivian felt the weight of what was coming. They'd drawn a line, made their position clear. Now Voss would have to respond. We need to get word to Thaddeus, James said. Warn him that Voss might be moving against us. How? Vivian asked. We don't even know exactly where he is. Somewhere between here and Fort Apache, tracking renegades that may or may not actually exist. The answer came that evening in the form of a young Apache scout who approached the ranch carefully, hands raised to show he meant no harm. James reached for his rifle, but Vivian stopped him. Wait, let him speak. The scout was perhaps 16, with the lean build of someone who'd grown up moving through harsh terrain. He spoke in halting English, clearly uncomfortable with the language. I'm called Swift-Foot. I carry message from Machu. He who whites call Thaddeus Mercer. Vivian's heart leaped. You've seen him? Is he safe? He's safe for now, Swift-Foot replied. He travels with Army Patrol, tracking Apache raiders. But the raiders are not Apache. They are white men dressed as Apache, attacking to create fear and justify taking more land. Voss, James said. As to be, Swift-Foot nodded. Machu knows this. He has proof. But the army captain he travels with does not believe. Thinks Machu lies to protect his people. So Machu sent me to warn you. Says the false raiders will come here next. We'll attack your ranch and blame Apache. We'll use it as reason to take your land. The strategy was brutally effective. Voss couldn't move against them directly without raising suspicion, so he'd create a situation that would accomplish the same goal while appearing to be an Apache raid. When? Vivian demanded. When will they come? 2 days, maybe 3, Swift-Foot said. Machu tries to stop them, but he is watched by army soldiers. Cannot act without revealing himself. He says you must defend until he can break away and return. Can you get a message back to him? Vivian asked. Swift-Foot nodded. I can find him. Apache scouts know how to move unseen. Vivian grabbed paper and wrote quickly. Tell him we know about the false raiders. Tell him we're preparing. And tell him, she hesitated, then wrote one more line. Tell him to come home safe. That I need him here. After Swift-Foot disappeared back into the desert, Vivian and James looked at each other with grim understanding. They had perhaps 48 hours to prepare for an attack designed to look like an Apache raid. We need more people, James said. We can't defend this place with just the vaqueros and us. Where do we find help? Vivian asked. Anyone who helps us becomes Voss's enemy. The answer came from an unexpected source. Maria arrived the next morning with a wagon full of supplies and 5 more men, all former Iron Crown workers who'd grown sick of Voss's methods. I heard what's coming, Maria said as she climbed down. I've been with Voss 15 years and I'm done. These men feel the same. We know what he's planning and we won't be part of it anymore. You'll be hunted, Vivian warned. Voss won't forgive this betrayal. Then we'd better make sure he's in no position to hunt anyone, Maria replied grimly. Now let's get this ranch ready for war. They worked through the day and into the night. Barricades were constructed from whatever materials they could find. Ammunition was distributed to defensive positions. Water barrels were positioned in case of fire. The vaqueros, experienced fighters who dealt with bandits before, showed them tactics for defending against superior numbers. One of them, an older man named Miguel, had fought with Juarez's forces in Mexico. "The key is not trying to win every fight," he explained. "It's making the cost so high that they give up. Make them bleed for every foot of ground. Make them wonder if this property is worth dying for." As they prepared, Vivian found herself thinking about Thaddeus, about his skill as a warrior, his knowledge of tactics and terrain. She wished desperately that he was here, not just for his fighting ability, but for his presence. In the short time they'd been married, she'd grown accustomed to his steady companionship. The attack came on the third night, just before dawn, when defenses were weakest and vision was poorest. Vivienne was on watch when she saw them approaching, more than a dozen riders moving in formation toward the ranch. "They're here," she called out, her voice carrying across the compound. Immediately, the defenders moved to their positions. James took up a rifle at the northwest corner. Maria and 2 men defended the barn. The vaqueros spread out to cover all approaches. The raiders came in fast, whooping and shouting in what was supposed to sound like Apache war cries, but struck Vivian as theatrical and false. They wore cloth over their faces and carried weapons, but their riding style was all wrong, too rigid and formal for Apache warriors. "Hold your fire until they're in range," Miguel called out. "Make every shot count." The raiders reached the outer fence and began their assault. Bullets slammed into the house walls and barn. One of the barricades caught fire from a thrown torch. But the defenders held steady, returning fire with disciplined accuracy. Vivian aimed carefully at a rider circling toward the barn. She squeezed the trigger, and the man tumbled from his horse, clutching his leg. The satisfaction she felt was immediately followed by horror at her own capacity for violence. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The raiders tried multiple approaches, but each time they were driven back by concentrated fire. 2 more attackers went down, one clearly dead, the other crawling away toward cover. Then everything changed. A new group of riders appeared on the ridge to the north, and for a moment Vivian's heart sank, thinking they were reinforcements for the raiders. But then she recognized the lead rider, Thaddeus, on Ghost. With an army patrol behind him and swift foot beside him, the Apache scout must have found him and convinced the army captain that the raiders were imposters. Now they descended on the attackers from an unexpected direction, catching them in a crossfire. The effect was immediate and devastating. The false raiders, realizing they were outnumbered and facing actual army soldiers, broke and ran. Several threw down their weapons in surrender. Others tried to escape, but were run down by the Apache scout and the soldiers. Within minutes, the attack was over. The raiders who hadn't fled were on the ground, either wounded or surrendering. Army soldiers moved through the compound, securing prisoners and assessing damage. Vivienne ran from her defensive position toward Thaddeus as he dismounted. He turned just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his arms, not caring who saw, not caring about propriety or reputation. "You're alive," she gasped against his chest. "You came back, I promised," Thaddeus said, his arms tightening around her. "I kept my promise." The army captain, a weathered man named Harrison, approached them with grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Mercer, your husband was right. These aren't Apache raiders. They're hired guns dressed up to create an incident. We've already identified 3 of them from wanted posters. They work for Clayton Voss," Vivian said. "This whole attack was orchestrated by him to take our land." "That's a serious accusation," Harrison said. "Do you have proof?" "Course, we have extensive proof," Thaddeus said, speaking more in that moment than he had in months. "Documented evidence of Voss's crimes going back 15 years, including payment records for false flag operations like this one." He pulled out the package he'd been carrying, the evidence they'd prepared for Captain Bennett. "I was taking this to Fort Benton when your patrol found the false raiders. Captain Bennett can verify everything in here." And now you have living witnesses who can testify about who hired them. Harrison took the package, his expression growing more serious as he scanned the top documents. If even half of this is legitimate, Clayton Voss is facing federal charges. This goes way beyond territorial jurisdiction. It's all legitimate, Vivian said firmly. My father died gathering that evidence, and we're prepared to testify to everything we've witnessed. Over the next hours, as the sun rose over the desert and army soldiers secured the prisoners, the full scope of the situation became clear. 2 of the captured raiders, facing hanging for attempted murder, were eager to trade testimony for leniency. They confirmed that Voss had hired them specifically to attack the Marshall Ranch, disguised as Apache. He told us to make it look like a massacre, one raider admitted. Said the more brutal, the better. Wanted the territorial governor to have justification for another Apache crackdown. Captain Harrison's face grew harder with each revelation. This is conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and false imprisonment. Mr. Voss has seriously miscalculated. He's done worse than this, Thaddeus said quietly. He showed Harrison the document about the Apache massacre Voss had paid for years earlier. This is personal for me. The woman killed in that attack was family. Harrison read the document, his jaw tightening. I was stationed at Fort Thomas when this happened. The official report said it was justified retaliation for raids. But there were rumors that something wasn't right. Now I know why. He looked at Thaddeus with new respect. You've been working for the man who had your family killed, and you still maintained enough control to gather evidence instead of just putting a bullet in him. That takes remarkable discipline, or remarkable patience, Thaddeus replied. Apache warriors learn to wait for the right moment. This is the right moment. As Harrison and his soldiers prepared to ride for Copper Ridge and arrest Clayton Voss, Vivian and Thaddeus finally had a moment alone. They walked to the creek that bordered their property, putting distance between themselves and the chaos of the compound. I was terrified, Vivian admitted. When the attack came and you weren't here, when I thought I might never see you again, I broke every rule to get back, Thaddeus said. Left the patrol without permission. Rode through the night. All I could think about was that you might be fighting alone. Might be hurt, or his voice broke slightly. I couldn't let that happen. Vivian reached up and touched his face, tracing the long scar that marked his cheek. When did this stop being just an alliance? When did it become something more? Thaddeus covered her hand with his. For me, the day you asked to see my journals, when you treated my pain as something worth understanding instead of something to be feared. That's when I started hoping that maybe this marriage could be more than survival. I don't know when it happened for me, Vivian said, but somewhere between reading your words and watching you gentle wild horses and learning to see past the legend to the man underneath, I started falling in love with you. The words hung in the desert air, honest and terrifying. Thaddeus stared at her, something breaking in his expression, years of carefully maintained walls crumbling. I love you too, he said, the Apache words coming first, then English. She-na-na-ye, I love you. I didn't think I was capable of it anymore. Thought that part of me died with my family, but you brought it back. Made me remember what it feels like to care about someone more than I care about revenge or justice or survival. He pulled her close, and this time when they kissed, it wasn't the chaste peck from their wedding. It was desperate and passionate, years of loneliness and pain, seeking comfort and connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. What happens now? Vivian asked. After Voss is arrested, after the trials, after everything settles? We build something new, Thaddeus said. Apache have a tradition. After great conflict, after loss and struggle, the people come together and rebuild. They don't try to return to what was before. They create something that honors the past while moving toward the future. I like that, Vivian said. Building something new together. They walked back toward the ranch hand in hand, 2 people who'd been forced together by circumstance, but who'd chosen to turn that force into something beautiful. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be trials and testimony. There would be social consequences for their interracial marriage. There would be people from both cultures who refused to accept them, but they would face it together. An Apache warrior who'd learned that strength wasn't just about violence, and a white woman who'd learned that justice sometimes required fighting for it with everything you had. As they reached the compound, Maria met them with news. Army riders just left for the Iron Crown. They're arresting Voss within the hour. Harrison says you're both needed to testify, but that can wait until tomorrow. For now you should rest. Rest sounds impossible, Vivian said, looking at the damage to their property. Bullet holes in the walls. Burned sections of fence. Blood in the dust. Not rest then, Maria corrected. Recover, process, be with each other. The work of rebuilding can wait until morning. She was right. Vivian and Thaddeus retreated to the house, closing the door on the world outside. For the first time since their marriage, they were truly alone together, with no more secrets between them. No more barriers of distrust or cultural divide. Tell me something, Vivian said as they sat together in the fading light. Something about your life before all of this. Something happy, Thaddeus thought for a moment. My father used to take me hunting in the early mornings. We'd move through the mountains so quietly that deer wouldn't know we were there until we chose to reveal ourselves. He said the best warriors weren't the loudest or the strongest, but the ones who understood patience. Who could wait for exactly the right moment? He smiled at the memory. One morning we tracked a mountain lion for hours, just to observe it, not to kill it. My father said some things were too beautiful to destroy. That real strength was knowing when to fight and when to simply witness and appreciate. Your father sounds like a wise man, Vivian said. He was, Thaddeus agreed. I wish you could have met him. Met all of them. My mother would have liked you. She always said the strongest people were the ones who chose kindness, even when the world gave them reasons to be cruel. They talked late into the night, sharing memories and dreams, fears and hopes. For the first time, Thaddeus spoke freely about his Apache heritage, about the traditions that had shaped him before the missionaries tried to erase them. And Vivian shared her own stories, about her father's idealism and her mother's strength. By the time they finally slept, wrapped in each other's arms, as the desert night pressed close, they were no longer just allies. They were partners in every sense. Husband and wife, not just in law, but in truth. And tomorrow, when the sun rose on a territory beginning to change, they would face it together. The arrest of Clayton Voss sent shockwaves through the Arizona territory that reverberated for months. When Captain Harrison and his soldiers arrived at the Iron Crown with federal warrants, they found Voss preparing to flee. His saddlebags were already packed with gold and documents he'd intended to destroy. The man who'd built an empire through violence and corruption was caught like a common criminal. The trial began 6 weeks later in Tucson, where federal jurisdiction meant Voss couldn't rely on his usual network of corrupt local officials. Vivian and Thaddeus testified for 3 days, presenting evidence that painted a damning picture of systematic criminality. The ledgers showing payments to hired killers. The correspondence arranging the Apache massacre. Witness statements from people who'd been too terrified to speak while Voss held power. But it was Thaddeus's testimony that proved most devastating. He spoke in both English and Apache, translated by an official interpreter, describing in precise detail every job he'd done for Voss, every threat delivered, every act of violence committed on the rancher's orders. He testified without emotion, reciting facts like a man reading from a ledger. But the cumulative effect was crushing. And you're testifying against the man who employed you, Voss's lawyer said during cross-examination, trying to discredit him. A man who gave you work when no one else would hire an Apache. Isn't this simply revenge for perceived slights? Thaddeus looked directly at Voss when he answered. Clayton Voss didn't give me work out of kindness. He saw a weapon he could use, an Apache who could move through terrain where white men couldn't follow. Someone expendable who wouldn't be missed if a job went wrong. He used me the same way he used everyone. The difference is, I survived long enough to see him brought to justice. Justice, the lawyer repeated mockingly. Is that what you call this? A savage testifying against a civilized man who tried to help him. I call it accountability, Thaddeus replied, his voice hard. something your client has avoided his entire life. But not anymore. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Clayton Voss was found guilty on 18 counts, including murder, conspiracy, fraud, and crimes against the Apache people. The judge sentenced him to hang, a sentence carried out 3 weeks later in the territorial prison. Vivian didn't attend the execution. Neither did Thaddeus. They were at the ranch when it happened, working together to repair the damage from the attack. When a rider brought news that Voss was dead, they simply nodded and continued their work. "Do you feel satisfied?" Vivian asked later that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Now that he's paid for what he did?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. "Satisfaction isn't the word. Relief, maybe. Justice was done, but it doesn't bring back the people he killed. Doesn't undo the pain he caused. It just stops him from causing more." He reached for her hand. "My father used to say that revenge is a poison that destroys the one who drinks it. But justice, real justice, is medicine that heals the community. Voss's death doesn't heal my wounds, but knowing he can't hurt anyone else, that's something." In the months following the trial, the Marshall Ranch became something unexpected. Word spread about the Apache warrior and white woman who'd brought down Clayton Voss. Some saw them as heroes, others as troublemakers who'd upset the social order. But increasingly, people began to see them as something else entirely. They became a bridge. Apache families who'd been displaced from their traditional lands began stopping at the ranch, seeking advice or simply a place where they'd be treated with respect. Thaddeus spoke with them in their native language, sharing news and offering what help he could. Some were suspicious of him at first, seeing his white wife and questioning his loyalty. But his actions spoke louder than prejudice. He used his share of the reward money from exposing Voss to buy food and supplies for Apache families struggling on inadequate reservations. He testified before territorial committees about the conditions on reservations and the systematic theft of Apache resources. He became an advocate, using his unique position between two worlds to speak truths that both sides needed to hear. For her part, Vivian reopened her father's newspaper, renaming it The Territory Truth. She wrote articles exposing corruption and championing reform. She published Apache voices alongside white ones, creating one of the few publications where indigenous people could tell their own stories in their own words. "You're making enemies," Sheriff Delaney warned her one afternoon when she stopped in Copper Ridge for supplies. "Powerful people don't like being questioned." "Then they shouldn't do things that deserve questioning," Vivian replied. "My father died because he believed truth mattered. I won't dishonor his memory by staying silent, but not everyone opposed them. Judge Watts, who'd once seemed complicit in Voss's schemes, revealed he'd been gathering his own evidence for years, too afraid to act until someone else made the first move. He became an unexpected ally, using his legal expertise to help draft reforms to land policies and reservation management. Maria opened a boarding house in Copper Ridge specifically for Apache families visiting town, giving them a safe place to stay where they wouldn't face harassment. She hired both Apache and Mexican staff, creating jobs and fostering understanding. James took over day-to-day management of the ranch, proving himself a capable administrator who treated the Mexican vaqueros and Apache workers with equal respect. He'd learned hard lessons about prejudice and worked actively to overcome them. But the greatest changes happened in Vivian and Thaddeus's relationship itself. What had begun as a forced alliance, transformed by necessity into partnership, had deepened into genuine love. 6 months after Voss's execution, Vivian discovered she was pregnant. She told Thaddeus one evening as they worked together in the barn, rebuilding sections damaged in the attack. "I'm carrying a child," she said simply. "Our child!" Thaddeus dropped the board he'd been holding, his face cycling through shock, fear, and finally joy. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain," Vivian confirmed. "Maria helped me figure it out. We'll have a baby by spring." Thaddeus pulled her close, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd have this. A family, a child. After losing everyone, I thought that part of life was closed to me forever. Are you afraid? Vivian asked, sensing the tension in his body. Terrified, Thaddeus admitted. This territory is still dangerous. There are people who hate what we represent. A child born to an Apache father and white mother will face prejudice from both sides. Then we'll teach them to be strong, Vivian said firmly, to stand proud in both heritages, to see their mixed blood not as a weakness, but as proof that different worlds can come together and create something beautiful. Thaddeus rested his forehead against hers. In Apache tradition, children are sacred. They're not just the future of one family, but of the entire people. Our child will be raised knowing both traditions, both languages, both ways of seeing the world. Yes, Vivian agreed, and they'll be loved. That's the most important thing. As Vivian's pregnancy progressed, Thaddeus became fiercely protective. He modified his work schedule to stay closer to the ranch. He learned traditional Apache practices for ensuring a healthy pregnancy and birth. And he spoke constantly to her belly in Apache, singing songs his mother had sung to him, telling stories of their ancestors. "What are you telling our child?" Vivian asked one evening, smiling as she watched him speak to her growing stomach. "I'm telling them about their grandmother who could weave baskets so beautiful that traders came from hundreds of miles to buy them," Thaddeus said. "About their grandfather who could track a single deer through mountains for days. But their Aunt Nolin who laughed like wind chimes." His voice grew softer. "I'm telling them about your father who fought for truth even when it cost him everything. About your mother who was strong enough to build a life in a harsh land. I want them to know all their ancestors from both sides so they understand the courage it took for them to exist." Winter came cold and hard to the Arizona Territory. The ranch was snowed in for days at a time, creating a cocoon of isolation that Vivian found surprisingly peaceful. She and Thaddeus spent long evenings by the fire, him teaching her Apache words and traditions, her reading aloud from books in English. "Do you ever regret it?" Thaddeus asked one night. "Giving up the life you could have had? You could have married someone respectable back east, had a comfortable life without the struggle and prejudice we face here." Vivian set down her book and looked at him seriously. "I regret nothing. Yes, life is harder here. Yes, we face challenges I never imagined. But I'm living authentically, fighting for things that matter. Loving someone who sees me as an equal partner rather than a possession." She moved closer to him. "You gave up more than I did. You live every day in the language and culture of the people who destroyed your world. You've built a life in the ruins of your people's defeat. That takes more courage than anything I've done." "I didn't have a choice," Thaddeus said quietly. "You always had a choice," Vivian corrected. "You could have chosen bitterness and violence, could have become the monster they tried to make you. Instead, you chose to survive with honor intact, to help others, even when you were barely surviving yourself. That's not weakness. That's strength. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers that transformed the desert into something almost magical." Vivian's pregnancy reached its final weeks, and Apache women from a nearby settlement came to help prepare for the birth. They brought traditional herbs and knowledge passed down through generations. One of them, an elderly woman named White Dove, had known Thaddeus's mother. She spent hours with him, sharing stories he'd never heard, filling in gaps in his memory. "Your mother would be proud of you," White Dove told him. "Not for the violence you survived, but for the man you became despite it. For finding love across the divide. For honoring both worlds you belong to." "I belong to neither world fully," Thaddeus said, voicing the fear he rarely admitted. "You belong to both," White Dove corrected. "That's different. Harder, yes, but also more valuable. The future will need people who can stand in two worlds, who can translate not just words but understanding." When Vivian's labor began, it was White Dove and Maria who attended her, using a combination of Apache tradition and practical frontier medicine. Thaddeus waited outside, pacing like a caged animal, until James finally made him sit down. "She's strong," James said. "She survived a siege and brought down a corrupt empire. She'll survive this. Women die in childbirth, Thaddeus said, voicing his deepest fear. My first wife died bringing my son into the world. What if history repeats? What if I lose her? You won't, James said firmly. Because Vivian is too stubborn to die, and because she loves you too much to leave you. The labor lasted through the night and into the morning. When Thaddeus finally heard the baby's cry, he stood frozen, afraid to hope. Then Maria appeared at the door, tears streaming down her face. You have a daughter, she said, strong and healthy. And Vivian is fine, tired but fine. Thaddeus pushed past her into the room where Vivian lay, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in cloth. The baby had Vivian's light brown hair, but Thaddeus's dark eyes and bronze skin. She was perfect, our daughter, Vivian said softly. Do you want to hold her? Thaddeus approached slowly, almost reverently. When Vivian placed the baby in his arms, he stared down at the tiny face with an expression of wonder and terror. She's so small, he whispered. So fragile. She's tougher than she looks, Vivian said. She has your strength and my stubbornness. She'll be fine. What should we name her? Thaddeus asked. They discussed this for months. Apache tradition held that names should reflect something significant about the person or circumstances of their birth. Western tradition typically honored family members. Narlin, Thaddeus said suddenly, after my sister, but also Catherine after your mother. Nalin Catherine Mercer, born in spring when the desert blooms. A child of two worlds. Narlin Catherine, Vivian repeated, smiling through exhausted tears. It's perfect. Word of the birth spread quickly, and the response revealed how much had changed in the territory. White families sent gifts alongside Apache ones. Mexican vaqueros celebrated with their Apache counterparts. What could have been a source of division became a moment of unexpected unity. Sheriff Delaney rode out to the ranch a week after the birth, bringing an official birth certificate. Judge Watts wanted to make sure this was filed properly, he said. Legal recognition of her existence, her heritage, her rights. He's also working on legislation that will protect children of mixed heritage from some of the legal discrimination they currently face. Things are changing, Vivian observed. Slowly, Delaney agreed. But yes, your stand against Voss opened doors. Showed people that maybe the old ways of thinking weren't working. There's still prejudice, still violence, still injustice. But there's also hope. As Narlin grew from newborn to infant, Thaddeus spent hours with her, speaking Apache and singing traditional songs. He taught her to recognize bird calls and the smell of coming rain. Vivian watched with joy as her stern warrior husband transformed into a doting father. You're spoiling her, Vivian teased one afternoon, finding them both napping together in the sunshine. She's my daughter, Thaddeus replied without opening his eyes. Spoiling her is my sacred duty. 1 year after Narlin's birth, on the anniversary of their forced wedding, Thaddeus surprised Vivian with a request. I want to marry you again, he said. Properly this time. Not a transaction forced by Voss's threats, but a real ceremony. Apache and white traditions both, a public declaration of our choice to be together. We're already married, Vivian said, though she was smiling. We're legally bound, Thaddeus corrected, but I want to marry you with full consent, full joy, full knowledge of what we're choosing. I want to stand before our community and say these words because I mean them, not because a judge commanded it. The ceremony took place in spring, 1 year after Narlin's birth, in a meadow near their ranch. Apache elders officiated alongside Judge Watts. The gathering included people from every culture in the territory. White and Apache and Mexican, all coming together to witness something unprecedented. Thaddeus spoke his vows first in Apache, then translated them himself. I vow to walk beside you as equals on this earth, to honor your strength and support your struggles, to raise our daughter, knowing both the world of her mother and the world of her father, to build with you a life that proves love can cross any divide. Vivian spoke in English, with Swiftfoot translating into Apache for those who didn't understand. I vow to see you not as the legend others created, but as the man I've come to know. to honor your pain and celebrate your joy, to stand with you against prejudice from all sides, to build with you a home where two worlds can meet and become one. When they kissed, the gathered crowd erupted in celebration that blended Apache ululations with Mexican music and white applause. It was chaotic and beautiful, and perfectly representative of what they were building. That evening, as the celebration continued around them, Thaddeus and Vivian slipped away to watch the sunset from their favorite spot overlooking the ranch. Nalin slept peacefully in Vivian's arms. "Do you remember what you told me that first day?" Vivian asked. "When I said I needed to understand who you were. I told you I would show you what I was, and then you would understand why you should run," Thaddeus recalled. "You were wrong," Vivian said gently. "What you showed me was a man worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a life with." Thaddeus pulled both his wife and daughter close. "I was taught that my people's way of life was ending, that the Apache would disappear into history. But looking at Nalin, at this community we're building, I realize that's not true. We're not ending, we're transforming, becoming something new while honoring what was the future," Vivian said. "The future," Thaddeus agreed. In the years that followed, their ranch became a model for what the territory could become. They built a school that taught both English and Apache, where children of all backgrounds learned together. They established a trading post that dealt fairly with Apache, Mexican, and white customers alike. They created jobs and opportunities without discrimination. Nalin grew up speaking 3 languages fluently, moving easily between cultures, comfortable in all worlds and limited by none. When she was 5, a second child arrived. A son they named John Edward after Vivian's father, with the Apache name Dasodaha, which meant swift runner. The prejudice didn't disappear. There were still incidents, still people who refused to accept them. But there were also moments of grace and understanding that would have been impossible before. Apache families and white families who'd been enemies for generations learning to coexist. Children playing together without seeing color or culture. Just other children. One evening, 10 years after their forced marriage, Thaddeus and Vivian sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Nalin was teaching her younger brother how to track rabbits, a skill she'd learned from her father. Their voices mixed English and Apache naturally, switching between languages as easily as breathing. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if Voss hadn't forced us together?" Vivian asked. "Sometimes," Thaddeus admitted. "You'd probably be back east, maybe married to someone safe and boring. I'd probably be dead, killed in some job for Voss, or simply giving up on life. So in a twisted way, Voss gave us this," Vivian said. "Voss created the circumstances," Thaddeus corrected. "But we created this. We chose to turn force into choice, to turn survival into love, to turn division into unity. And that was us, not him." He took her hand, running his thumb over the calluses that years of ranch work had created. "You know what the greatest revenge against Voss is? Not his execution, not his legacy being destroyed. It's this, us, happy, thriving, building exactly the kind of future he tried to prevent. Living well is the best revenge," Vivian quoted. "Living well and loving freely," Thaddeus amended. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in impossible colors, Vivian reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She'd come west seeking a new beginning after her father's death. She'd been forced into a marriage with a man her society called savage. She'd faced violence, prejudice, and dangers she'd never imagined, but she'd also found love in the most unexpected place. She'd discovered strength she didn't know she possessed. She'd learned that the divisions between people were often smaller than the similarities. And she'd helped build something that would outlast them both, a community, a family, a future. Thaddeus looked at her, his dark eyes soft with affection. "What are you thinking about?" "Gratitude," Vivian said simply, "for the journey that brought us together, for the love we found, for the life we've built, even though it started with force?" Thaddeus asked. "Especially because it started with force," Vivian replied. Anyone can fall in love under ideal circumstances. We fell in love despite everything working against us. That makes it stronger, more real. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children play in the fading light. We were bound together by circumstance, but we chose to make those bonds mean something. That's the story I want our children to remember. Not that we were forced together, but that we chose to love anyway. And that choice, Thaddeus said quietly, made all the difference. The desert night settled around them, stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and Thaddeus smiled at the sound. "Your namesake," Vivian observed. "Maybe," Thaddeus said, "or maybe just a wolf being a wolf. Not a legend, not a symbol. Just a creature living its life like us," Vivian said. "Like us," Thaddeus agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the children's laughter rang out across the ranch they'd defended and built together. This land that had seen so much violence and pain was now nurturing hope and growth. And at the center of it all was something simple and profound. Two people who'd been forced together by circumstance, who'd chosen to transform that force into love, and who were building a future that honored both their pasts while creating something entirely new. The story that began with a warrior no man dared cross and a woman bound to him against her will had become something neither could have imagined. Not a tragedy, but a triumph. Not an ending, but a beginning. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, as the desert breathed its evening song, as their children played in the dust their ancestors had fought over, Vivian and Thaddeus knew one essential truth. Love, real love, doesn't erase the past or make hard things easy, but it makes the struggle worthwhile. It transforms survival into living, and it proves that even the deepest divides can be crossed when two people choose to meet in the middle. They had been bound together by forces beyond their control, but they had chosen to stay together by forces within their hearts, and that choice had changed everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.